Survival responses and boundaries. Survival responses meaning when we're in fight, flight, freeze, shut down, or appease and appease, all of those different ways that we go into when we feel like we're under threat. Dr. Kay Vogt is a psychologist. I worked with her quite a few years ago now, 6, 8, 10 years ago, through the family services at the Killavy Center. And I always loved the way she worked with boundaries. Some of these things make so much sense when we look at them, and yet we can look at our own relationships and go, I don't know if I'm really always acting like an adult in my relationships. I think that would be true for most of us, certainly true for me. In a healthy relationship, both people act like adults. They take equal responsibility for their emotional reactions and talk things out rather than acting things out. And I know a lot of the time, if we're not able to be regulated enough, we're not able to know what it is we're feeling, or we're triggered or activated by someone else, we often go into a fight, flight, or freeze. And we don't really see what our part is. We don't have that clarity. She goes on to go even further to say that it is a form of emotional abuse to not validate another person's perception. In order to do that, we're going to have to actually be here and be present and be available to the other person, which we're not so much if we're in a fight, flight, or freeze. And it's not just gaslighting, although that's an extreme form of someone trying to make us doubt our own reality and make us think what I'm saying must not be right. But more commonly, we'll just assume that I'm right and you're wrong. We're not really seeing the other person. We're shoring up our own position. And getting back into the nervous system is we can't really do that. We can't manage our own anxiety. We can't be regulated unless we can learn to tolerate saying and listening to challenging information. One of the ways that we can do that and that we work with all the time is the somatic mindfulness and mindfulness of our thoughts. Also, what am I feeling? What does this relate to from my past? We all have trouble with this, and nobody, no matter how old we are, is perfectly self regulated. We need to be able to manage our own regulation, partly so that we can be clear and present, and partly so that the other person can co regulate with us as well. When we're not emotionally regulated, the other person's probably not going to be, then everything just blows up. We're not able to maintain our own boundaries. We're not able to set good boundaries. They're not received well. And it leads to that acting out rather than talking things out. And sometimes, even if we are acting something out, we can come back into clarity and regulation and then talk things out. So all is not lost. When to say yes and when to say no is part of feeling comfortable when we're interacting with others. And in order to do that, we really need to be present. Again, we need to not be in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, or at least we need to have a toe in ventral vagal, as Deb Dana would say, meaning we need to have at least a little bit of awareness of what it is that we're doing. When these parts of us come up, maybe it's a part from our childhood, it's a protector part, it's a part that's going to dissociate. When that comes up, then we need to be able to come back into regulation. Some of what we've already been working with around not taking things personally, setting ourselves up to get enough rest and have enough safety that we can be present. That's the foundation of all of this other. To communicate acceptable and unacceptable behaviors, first we have to be in the room. If we're in a state of freeze, like I often was in my long-term relationship, I wasn't really able to even notice sometimes because I had already disappeared. To be able to communicate our needs and create clarity takes two people or everybody if it's a multiple person relationship in a family, for instance. All of that is based on our past. So if we had the experience when we were a child, especially, but also in prior relationships, where we would say, this is how I feel, this is what I need, and we were discarded or dismissed or told we were too sensitive, or maybe we were yelled at, the person that we said that to shamed us or went into a rage response, then we're going to feel a lot more hesitation around saying something now. And the reason why these patterns continue is because we don't want to risk the connection. We don't want to have conflict. We want to have inclusion. And that's the unconscious reason why often we're complicit in this, that we feel anxious that if I was to actually be true to myself and say who I am and set boundaries, that we would be kicked out. And it's not a unreasonable fear. Sometimes that happens. Oftentimes we're the one who's not really welcome because we're always causing trouble by trying to get some clarity and establish some healthy boundaries. I'm going to read through some of these slowly and see what that feels like for you when you hear that. These are some examples. Most of them are from Dr. Vogt of healthy boundaries. We're going to work with just saying no in a moment. These are some of the phrases that we might use. Bring to mind somebody that you might want to set a boundary with. Maybe it's something you've done a lot already. You've already set boundaries with them and they're not respecting them. Somebody who always drops by without calling, or someone who always expects you to be there without asking, whatever it is, bring something to mind and settle back into that. Notice your body and your breath. You could hold your own hands. You could look around the room for cues. They're not actually here. You could look around and then get settled and then see what comes up with these statements. If you were to imagine saying the statement to that person, please respect my decision. I don't feel comfortable sharing with you because you tend to tell me what you think I should do. You don't listen. This is what's healthy for me. I don't have to explain it. And this next one is something we would have to be pretty well regulated ourselves at the time in order to say. And I think it's such a powerful statement. When we have a disagreement, I would like for you to use a lower tone and take a break if you feel you're getting too heated. I will also say when I'm uncomfortable. Imagine you're in the middle of the conflict. Somebody else is yelling at you, or maybe they're using a very sharp or contemptuous tone. You might say, I'd like you to use a kinder tone. Imagine yourself saying that. Or if it's somebody who shows up without calling or asking if it's okay to visit, you open the door and say, call before you stop by for a visit. This is not a good time for me. This is another one that I think would be fairly common of somebody who's fighting back when you set a boundary. Visualize that person and that you might say to them something like, I understand that you don't like my boundary, and setting this boundary helps me feel safer in our relationship. With any of these, if you're feeling like it's getting pretty intense, you could do some tapping on your forehead. You could put the image of them, the look on their face when you've said that, into a frame. You could notice there's the image, the frame. Take your eyes into the empty space on the outside of the frame. Take your eyes around that a couple of times in each direction. The reason that we don't set healthy boundaries is that it's hard. First, we have to be very regulated. We have to have the courage and the optimism that it will be worth it to say these things. Notice what state you're in right now. Are you edging more into a fight response? Are you disconnected, like a flight? Are you feeling like, oh, if I said that, and they're like, what do you mean you don't feel safe? Then you might go into some kind of appeasing behavior. Notice where you are right now and then come back into your own body. Take a few breaths, hold your own hands perhaps, look around the room. Notice how you're feeling. And these are just examples. They're not anything that you would necessarily say. You would use your own words, obviously, as well, if you wanted. Even something like, please back up to a distance of 6 feet. I have said that since COVID in public spaces. If someone's getting behind me and they're getting quite close, sometimes I'll turn and say, please back up. You're not 6 feet away. I'd feel more comfortable if you were 6 feet from me. That might be a little bit easier one with less charge to it, to work with one of those that you might do in public rather than in close relationships. These are also things that you might say when you're not in the middle of a fight. Like when you're talking about when you have a disagreement, I'd like you to use a lower tone, take a break. That would be something that you would probably say when you're talking about that when nobody's heated. Be able to talk that out instead of acting it out. One of the things about the polyvagal system, the polyvagal ladder, it's a way to organize our nervous system responses. We have the freeze at the bottom, the parasympathetic. And this parasympathetic nervous system, neither one of these are bad. It's just that this is how they work. Parasympathetic nervous system, partly we activate when we do those long exhales. It's part of how we return to calm and homeostasis. When it's too activated, that's when we go into a freeze or a shutdown. The sympathetic nervous system is what allows us to move about in the world. We can feel. When it's really activated, sometimes it ignites that fear and aggression. We might go into the fight response because the brain is perceiving a threat. This is something that we move up and down all the time. It's not normal to always be in a state of calm. If it feels like that, more likely that at least part of the time that's a state of freeze. We want to be able to recognize them and have tools to come back into regulation when we see them. Let's take a moment here to look into this. I can survive the discomfort of setting boundaries with that person or those people that you were just working with. I can survive that discomfort. I can survive their disapproval if they're angry with me. Keep coming back into regulation, remembering that we're here doing an inquiry. They're not actually here. We're not actually saying it. We're going to move into the saying no. All of this building up to this. Bring to mind this person again. What we're going to do is feel into whatever the situation you want to work with. Your boundaries have been crossed and you want to say no. Notice what's here right now, but then we're going to move into the shutdown or the freeze. Imagine that you're in a situation, somebody's saying something that you're feeling like they're crossing a boundary, and you're going to say no. But right now, you're in a state of freeze. What does that feel like in your body? We're often disconnected. We might be afraid. We might be holding our breath. You don't have to say this out loud, or you could. But imagine saying no. Somebody's crossing a boundary. You notice that you're really in a state of freeze. You're shut down. What would your voice sound like? How would you say no? It would probably not be very strong. Maybe no. There wouldn't be a lot of heat behind it. You want them to go away. When we shut down, we want them to go away. Take a moment for that. no. And now let that one go and move to a feeling of anger or fight response. Someone's crossed a boundary and you are angry with them. Bring this to mind, see them, see their face, or however that might come to you. And now practice saying no while you're angry. You can say it out loud if you want. What's your tone of voice? What's the energy of that in your body? No. It's likely to be a lot stronger. Practice that a couple of times. And now come back into ventral vagal. Hold your own hands or look around the room a little bit. We're doing a practice here, and it might be an activating practice for sure. Imagine now that you're completely calm. You're in a situation where perhaps you predicted that this might happen and you're ready for it. You've kept awareness of your breath. You're looking at the person and you're saying no. You're calm. You feel connected to yourself and you're saying no. Practice that out loud a couple of times. Notice what that feels like in your body. No, no. It doesn't have that heat. It doesn't have that fear of being shut down, that you want it to go away. This is something you want to address, and you're feeling confident and trusting yourself that you could bring that forward. If you wanted to practice with this later, you could also practice using some of those sentences that we had before, like, please respect my decision. That might be something you might say if you're in a state of ventral vagal. You're calm, trusting, connected.